On July 3, 1940, at precisely 5:54 in the afternoon, the unthinkable happened. The British Royal Navy opened fire on its former ally, the French fleet. In just 10 minutes of devastating bombardment, 1,297 young French sailors would be dead. A proud warship, the battleship Bretagne, would sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean, and one of the most controversial military operations of the Second World War would forever alter the relationship between two nations that had fought side by side for decades. This is not a story of heroism. It is not a story of clear-cut good versus evil. This is a story of impossible choices, calculated risks, and the terrible price of uncertainty during war. The operation was called Operation Catapult, a name that sounds almost benign, almost tactical. But for those who lived through it, for the families who lost sons and brothers and husbands, it was something else entirely. It was the moment when one nation betrayed another, not out of malice, but out of fear. Winston Churchill would later call it the most hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful action in which I have ever participated. And yet, he authorized it, because he believed he had to. If he was wrong, if the German Navy obtained the French fleet, Britain would lose the war. This is the story of what happened at Mers el Kébir. This is the story of Admiral Gensoul, who refused to surrender his ships to the British, believing he would die defending French honor. This is the story of Captain Cedric Holland, who tried desperately to negotiate peace and prevent bloodshed, and of the battleship Strasbourg, which miraculously escaped destruction and became a symbol of French defiance. And this is the story of how history proved everyone wrong in the most devastating way possible. To understand why Churchill made this decision, you must first understand the catastrophic collapse of France. Germany invaded France on May 10, 1940. 6 weeks later, France had surrendered. The speed of the collapse was stunning. The French army, once considered one of the most formidable in Europe, disintegrated like sand in the wind. German blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed French defenses that had been designed for a different kind of war entirely. By June 22nd, France signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. The terms were humiliating, but, from the French perspective, necessary. France had lost the war, and now it had to come to terms with the victor. Under the armistice agreement, France would be divided into two zones: the German-occupied zone in the north and west, and the unoccupied Vichy zone in the south, supposedly independent, but effectively subordinate to German interests. But one thing remained unclear: what would happen to the French Navy? The armistice specifically stated that the French fleet would remain under French control and would not be handed over to Germany. Admiral François Darlan, the commanding officer of the French Navy, had given his personal word to the British that under no circumstances would the fleet fall into German hands. If Germany tried to seize it, Darlan promised, the French would scuttle, deliberately sink, the ships themselves. But Churchill did not trust that promise completely. Or rather, Churchill believed that Darlan wanted to keep his word, but questioned whether he could. The French government was now in the hands of Marshal Philippe Pétain, an elderly First World War hero who had negotiated the armistice. Pétain had appointed a new government, the Vichy regime, and this government had made it clear that it intended to cooperate with Nazi Germany in many respects. Would Darlan be able to resist German pressure indefinitely if Berlin demanded the fleet as part of a larger settlement? Churchill could not afford to find out. The French Navy was no small matter. It was the fourth largest navy in the world. It included two modern battleships of the Dunkirk class, Dunkerque and Strasbourg, two older battleships, Bretagne and Provence, the modern battleship Richelieu in Dakar, multiple cruisers and destroyers, and dozens of smaller warships and submarines. If Germany obtained this fleet, the balance of power at sea would tilt dangerously. If German naval power combined with the French and the Italian fleets, Britain could lose control of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. Without naval superiority, Britain could not defend itself or keep its sea lanes open. Without naval superiority, American supplies that Britain desperately needed might never arrive. The mathematics of war seemed simple. The French Navy plus the German Navy plus the Italian Navy equaled Britain's defeat. Churchill understood this. He had seen France fall in weeks and had watched his ally collapse before his eyes. Now he faced the possibility that the weapons of that fallen ally might be used against him. "We must neutralize the French fleet," Churchill told his war cabinet. "If we do not, and if Germany seizes control of it, we will lose this war." Some of his advisers argued against him. Darlan had given his word, they said, and the French had always been honorable. Surely they could be trusted. But Churchill had made his decision, and later wrote that the only option was to ensure that the French fleet could not become a weapon in enemy hands, and that everything else was secondary. This logic led directly to Operation Catapult. At the naval base of Mers el Kébir, near the Algerian city of Oran, Vice Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul commanded the French fleet. He was a career naval officer in his 60s, a veteran of the First World War who had risen through the ranks in the interwar years. Gensoul was not a man given to dramatics. He was a professional who had devoted his life to the French Navy. His ships were his country, his crews his responsibility. When the British ultimatum arrived, Gensoul faced an impossible choice. In reality, he faced 4 impossible choices. On July 3rd, around midday, Captain Cedric Holland arrived at Mers el Kébir under a flag of truce. Holland was fluent in French, a rarity among British naval officers, and had served as naval attaché at the British Embassy in Paris, giving him personal relationships with French officers. He was, by all accounts, a good choice for this delicate mission. If anyone could make the French understand the British position, it was Holland. He carried a written ultimatum offering 4 options: join with Britain and continue fighting against Germany and Italy, sail the ships to British ports where they would remain under British control, send the ships to distant neutral or colonial ports for demilitarization, or scuttle them where they lay. For Gensoul, each option was politically or morally unacceptable. Joining Britain in continued resistance would openly violate the French armistice with Germany. The Vichy government would consider him a traitor, and he could face court-martial and execution. Sailing to British ports meant surrendering French naval assets to a foreign power, an unthinkable act for a French admiral. Sending ships to faraway ports still meant abandoning them, and raised doubts over whether France would ever regain control. And scuttling the fleet in place would be an act of self-destruction that confirmed French defeat and humiliated the nation. In the early afternoon, Gensoul and Holland met aboard the battleship Dunkerque. The French admiral was irritated that a captain, rather than a British admiral, was delivering such an ultimatum, seeing it as a slight to his rank and honor. Naval protocol, in his view, demanded that admirals deal with admirals. Holland tried to explain the urgency of the situation. He told Gensoul that as a friend of France, he believed these ships were too valuable to risk them falling into German hands, and that Britain was offering solutions, however harsh, to prevent that. Gensoul listened but was unmoved, telling Holland that he appreciated his sincerity, but could not accept an ultimatum delivered by an officer of lower rank, nor accept terms that betrayed French honor. Holland stressed that time was running out, and that Admiral James Somerville, commanding the British force outside the harbor, had set a strict deadline. The French would need to comply within hours, or the British would open fire. Gensel said he would consider the offer and attempted to contact Admiral Darlan at Vichy for instructions, but Darlan was unavailable, and Gensel was able to reach only a deputy who could not decide such a matter. Gensel was, in the end, alone with the decision. Around mid-afternoon, he sent a message to the British that read in French, "Do not create something irreparable." It was a plea for more time, for continued negotiation, and for a path that would avoid fratricidal bloodshed. But British patience was limited, and the strategic stakes loomed large in London. At about 5:30 in the afternoon, Somerville sent a final message giving the French 15 minutes to accept the British terms, after which the Royal Navy would open fire. Facing his moment of truth, Gensel could surrender, he could scuttle, or he could resist. He chose to fight. Shortly before the deadline expired, he ordered all ships to prepare to answer force with force and to man battle stations. It was a decision made in the name of honor and sovereignty, but it would prove catastrophically costly in lives. Captain Cedric Holland, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a role he had never sought. He was not merely a messenger, but a man delivering a death sentence to people he considered friends. Holland had built a career partly on his understanding of France and his affection for its people. In his own later recollections and letters, he described feeling like a traitor as he handed Gensel the British ultimatum. He wrote to his wife that the admiral had looked at him with confusion and pain, unable to reconcile the message with the man delivering it. Holland emphasized to Gensel that Britain was not seeking an act of naked aggression, but an act of necessity to ensure survival. He pointed out that if the German Navy ever obtained the French ships, it could dominate the seas and strangle Britain into submission. Gensel responded that Holland was asking him to betray his country by surrendering French ships to foreign control. He argued that to scuttle the fleet or hand it over would be a final capitulation and a betrayal of the French people. He believed his duty required him to preserve the fleet under French authority. Holland suggested scuttling as a last resort, urging that it was better for France to destroy its own ships than to see them seized by Germany or destroyed by Britain. Gensel, however, believed that French honor could be preserved without such an extreme step, trusting that Darlan's promise to scuttle, if necessary, would be upheld. Gensel's faith in French intentions clashed directly with British fear of German power. As the afternoon waned, Holland realized the window for peaceful resolution was closing. He told Gensel that he feared violence was now inevitable. Gensel replied that if violence came, the French would meet it as Frenchmen. The two men parted, and Holland returned to his ship, Foxhound, knowing that within hours or even minutes the harbor might be engulfed in fire. In later letters recovered in British archives, Holland expressed deep anguish over his role. He wondered whether a different approach, different words, or more time could have changed Gensel's mind. He concluded that the situation was defined by French pride on one side and British fear on the other, and that neither side could retreat without sacrificing something fundamental. Holland survived the war, but the memory of Mers el Kébir never left him. At exactly 5:54 in the afternoon on July 3, 1940, the British guns spoke. A signal from Admiral Somerville aboard HMS Hood set the attack in motion. Within seconds, the battlecruiser's 15-inch guns unleashed their first salvo. Each shell weighed close to a ton and could pierce thick armor before exploding with devastating force. Hood was firing from almost 16 kilometers away, a long-range shot demanding precise calculations of distance, wind, and target movement. Moments later, the battleships HMS Valiant and HMS Resolution joined in, their own heavy guns adding to the inferno. Inside the harbor, the French ships lay at anchor, confined and largely unable to maneuver. Their crews had been at battle stations for hours, but now their worst fears were being realized. The first British salvos splashed into the water near the French ships, but did not hit directly. For a brief moment, some French sailors hoped that the British might be firing warning shots, or that poor visibility and range would spare them. That hope evaporated when a later salvo found its mark. Two shells in particular changed the course of the battle within seconds. One of them slammed into the battleship Bretagne near her rear turret, turret number 4. The explosion was colossal, sending flames higher than the mainmast. Steel structures were twisted and torn apart, and the shock wave raced through the ship. The next shell struck even more catastrophically, hitting the central engine room, the very heart of the vessel. The engine room was crowded with engineers, stokers, and mechanics who kept the ship alive. The shell detonated inside that enclosed space, killing almost everyone instantly. Electrical power was lost, plunging internal compartments into darkness and severing communication between decks. Damage control teams could not coordinate an effective response, and within moments, Bretagne was mortally wounded. The bombardment did not pause. Minutes later, 2 more shells struck near turret number 3, igniting ready-use ammunition. The resulting chain reaction of explosions tore through the ship. At about 9 minutes past 5, a gigantic internal explosion consumed Bretagne. The blast was visible from far away, and observers later described it as a column of smoke and fire rising like a pillar into the sky. The battleship began to list sharply as seawater poured through the ruptured hull. Compartments flooded, bulkheads collapsed, and the weight of water dragged the ship over. Within minutes, Bretagne rolled completely and sank, her keel rising briefly above the surface, before disappearing beneath the waves. A ship that had served France for decades had been destroyed in less than 20 minutes. The human toll aboard Bretagne was almost total. Around 1,012 officers and men were aboard, and essentially all of them were killed. Official figures list over 1,000 dead, including dozens of officers, more than 150 petty officers, and hundreds of sailors. Only a handful of survivors escaped by jumping into the water before the ship capsized. One survivor later recalled standing on deck as the first shells hit, and seeing men beside him simply vanish, torn apart or vaporized by the blast. He described the sound as something beyond ordinary noise, as if the very sky were screaming. With the ship tilting and smoke everywhere, he and others realized they could not reach those trapped below. They leapt into the water, hoping against hope to be picked up by small boats in the chaos. While Bretagne was being annihilated, Dunkirk was also taking heavy punishment. A shell hit near her forward turret, starting fires and disrupting command and control. Dunkirk's crew fought to keep her afloat, and under some semblance of control. Realizing that sinking in deep water would mean total loss, her officers decided to run her aground deliberately in shallow water near the shore. By beaching the ship, they prevented her from entirely submerging, but she was heavily damaged and out of the fight. Provence, another older battleship, was also hit repeatedly. Like Dunkirk, she managed to run herself aground while on fire and badly damaged, surviving as a hulk rather than a total wreck. The destroyer escort Mogador suffered a horrific hit from a heavy armor-piercing shell intended for battleships. When that shell struck Mogador's stern, it blew off almost the entire rear section of the ship. Dozens of sailors were killed, and many more were wounded. Remarkably, the main magazines in the aft section did not detonate, which very likely saved the ship from instant destruction. As fires raged and systems failed, Mogador nevertheless stayed afloat and was later towed for repairs. All of this devastation occurred in roughly 10 to 15 minutes of intense fire. The French ships fired back, but their ability to respond was quickly crippled by hits, smoke, loss of power, and confusion. Eventually, their guns fell mostly silent, not because they had surrendered, but because many of their weapons were destroyed or could no longer be effectively manned. Around 6 in the evening, Somerville ordered the British ships to cease fire. The harbor was now a scene of fire, smoke, and wreckage. The military aim of crippling the French capital ships at Mers el Kébir had been achieved at a terrible cost. Yet amid this destruction, one great French warship had escaped. While Bretagne was dying, and Dunkirk and Provence were burning and grounded, the battleship Strasbourg was carrying out an audacious breakout. Strasbourg was a sister ship to Dunkirk, a fast modern battleship with powerful guns and good armor. Her captain, Louis Collinet, had anticipated that negotiations might fail and that the British could open fire at any moment. Before orders came from Gensoul, Collinet had already begun quietly preparing his ship for emergency departure. He had boilers warmed, engines readied, and crew alerted to the possibility of a dash for the open sea. When the British bombardment began, Collinet wasted no time. He ordered full power and anchors raised, intent on forcing his way out of the harbor. This was a bold decision, because the British had mined the harbor exit with magnetic mines. These devices were meant to detect the metal mass of a passing ship and detonate, potentially blowing its hull open. Many commanders might have hesitated at such a risk. Collinet chose speed over caution. Strasbourg surged forward, accelerating toward the narrow harbor mouth at high speed. The theory, whether consciously calculated or not, was that speed and luck might carry the ship through before a mine could detonate effectively. In a feat that later seemed almost miraculous, Strasbourg passed through the minefield without being destroyed. By around 6:15, Strasbourg had broken clear of Mers el Kébir into open water. But she was far from safe. HMS Hood and other British ships now set off in pursuit. Strasbourg's engines pushed her to about 28 knots, an impressive speed for a battleship, roughly 50 kilometers per hour. Shell splashes rose around her as British gunners tried to hit the fleeing silhouette. The British shells fell closer at times, but did not score a decisive hit. The increasing distance and fading light worked in Strasbourg's favor. Then came the aerial element. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal launched Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, those slow, fabric-covered biplanes that had already proven deadly in other naval actions. Each carried a torpedo capable of crippling or sinking a battleship if it struck true. As the Swordfish approached, Strasbourg's anti-aircraft guns erupted in a curtain of fire. The crews knew that a single torpedo could end their voyage. They filled the sky with bursting shells, tracers, and shrapnel. 2 of the Swordfish were shot down, their crews perishing in the sea. Other planes managed to drop their torpedoes, sending deadly tracks of white foam streaking through the water toward the French ship. Whether through skilled maneuvering, luck, or mechanical failure of the torpedoes, Strasbourg avoided them. Some passed close enough for the crew to see their lethal shapes slicing through the water, but none struck the hull. One torpedo, aimed poorly or defectively armed, missed Strasbourg entirely and instead hit the small patrol vessel Terre Neuve near Dunkirk, causing further carnage there. As evening deepened, Strasbourg continued to widen the gap between herself and the British. Hood could not quite close the distance, and firing at extreme range in poor light became increasingly ineffective. Finally, concerned about fuel, nightfall, and the risk of submarines, Somerville broke off the chase. Strasbourg steamed on through the night, battered by the emotional toll but physically intact. In the early hours of July 4th, Strasbourg arrived at Toulon. She was greeted as a symbol of survival and defiance. Flags flew, and the ship's escape was celebrated as a rare, bright moment in an otherwise disastrous episode. Captain Collinet's name became synonymous with daring and decisiveness in French naval circles. Strasbourg's survival showed that, even in catastrophe, there could be moments of resilience. Meanwhile, at Mers el Kébir, the French counted their dead and tried to grasp what had happened. The official toll of 1,297 French sailors killed in the attack made clear the scale of the tragedy. Hundreds more were wounded. British losses were minimal by comparison, with a few aircraft shot down and small numbers of aircrew killed. But in political and emotional terms, Britain had paid a heavy price. On July 8th, Marshal Pétain formally broke off diplomatic relations with Britain. In a statement, the Vichy government denounced the British attack as an unprovoked act of war against a nation that now claimed neutrality. In Vichy propaganda, Mers el Kébir became proof that Britain could not be trusted and that France had to look to Germany for a new order in Europe. For many French citizens, the attack felt like a deep betrayal. Admiral Darlan, furious at the destruction of his ships and the deaths of his sailors, initially ordered French forces to attack any British vessel encountered. Cooler heads in the Vichy leadership, including Pétain and Foreign Minister Paul Baudouin, quickly realized that a full-scale war with Britain would be disastrous. Those orders were quietly rescinded, replaced instead by more limited gestures of retaliation. The most visible of those gestures were air raids on Gibraltar. French bombers based in North Africa made several attacks on the British fortress at the mouth of the Mediterranean. The first raid, in early July, involved a small number of bombers and caused little damage, with many bombs falling into the sea. Later raids in September were larger and inflicted some casualties and local damage, but they did not seriously impair British capabilities. For all their noise and smoke, the raids on Gibraltar were more symbolic than strategic. They signaled to the French public and to Germany that Vichy France had answered British aggression. Yet they also remained limited enough not to drag France into an all-out war with Britain. In this uneasy atmosphere, a kind of sullen truce eventually settled over relations between the two former allies. In the longer term, however, the attack at Mers el Kébir had strengthened hard-line elements within the Vichy regime. Pétain and his supporters could present themselves as defenders of French honor against not only German demands, but also British treachery. This gave them greater leverage in justifying collaboration with Germany as a way to preserve what remained of French sovereignty and territory. The attack thus had unintended political consequences. All the while, the question of the remaining French fleet, especially the ships at Toulon, remained unresolved. Britain had crippled some ships and seized others in British ports, but much of the French Navy still existed. It was here that the irony of history would play out. 2 years after the guns at Mers el Kébir fell silent, in November 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch, landing forces in North Africa. In response, Hitler ordered German forces to occupy the rest of Vichy France, an operation known as Operation Anton. One of the main German objectives was to seize the French fleet at Toulon. German armor and infantry advanced toward the port in late November, hoping to capture the ships intact and add them to the Axis naval arsenal. This was precisely the nightmare scenario Churchill had feared back in 1940. But the French Naval Command had prepared for this possibility. Admiral Jean de Laborde, commanding the fleet at Toulon, held secret orders that if the Germans attempted to seize the ships, they were to be scuttled. Early on November 27, 1942, as German troops entered Toulon and approached the docks, French crews sprang into action. They opened seacocks, set scuttling charges, and ignited fires. One after another, major warships were deliberately sunk by their own crews. Dunkirk, damaged and beached at Mers el Kébir and later brought to Toulon, was scuttled. Provence was scuttled. Strasbourg, the very ship that had braved British shells and swordfish torpedoes to escape from Mers el Kébir, was also scuttled by her own crew. Oil fires burned, explosions echoed, and smoke rolled across the harbor as proud ships settled onto the harbor bottom. In total, 16 major warships and many smaller vessels were destroyed in this act of self-sabotage. Some sailors died in the process, though the casualties were far smaller than at Mers el Kébir. German troops, arriving to seize a powerful modern fleet, instead found a graveyard of half-submerged, burning hulks. The French had kept Darlan's word, perhaps more faithfully than Churchill had ever imagined they would. This act of mass scuttling was both a strategic denial and a symbolic statement. It declared that, whatever the politics of Vichy, the French Navy would not sail under the Nazi flag. It was a final proof that the French did indeed prefer to sink their ships rather than see them captured. For historians, this moment underscored the bitter irony of Churchill's earlier decision. The catastrophe he had sought to prevent was something the French themselves would never have allowed. Had Churchill somehow known that in November 1942 French crews would sink their own fleet rather than surrender it, his calculus in July 1940 might have been very different. The 1,297 French sailors killed at Mers el Kébir died to prevent a scenario that never actually came to pass. The French Navy was never used by Germany against Britain. Instead, it died by French hands. Yet Churchill, in 1940, did not possess the luxury of hindsight. He made his decision in the fog of war, with incomplete information, facing an enemy that had just crushed France and was threatening Britain directly. The irony that history later revealed did not negate the fear that drove his choice. It did, however, complicate the moral judgment of Operation Catapult. Beneath the strategic logic and political consequences lay the human dimension of Mers el Kébir. Most of the 1,297 French sailors killed were young men in their late teens or 20s. Many had never seen combat before. They had joined the Navy to serve their country, to see the world, perhaps to escape poverty. Their letters home, preserved in archives, capture their hopes and fears in the days before the attack. One such letter, attributed to a petty officer named Jean-Claude Martin aboard Bretagne, spoke of pride in serving France and of rumors that the British fleet was nearby. He wrote that some men were nervous and some angry, but that he tried to remain calm and wanted his mother to be proud of him, even if something happened to him at sea. If she read the letter, it meant he had not survived, but he hoped she would remember him with pride rather than only grief. Jean-Claude, like most of his shipmates, died when Bretagne exploded and sank. Other letters, written by survivors to the families of fallen comrades, tried to offer what comfort they could. One survivor from Dunkirk wrote to a friend's mother that her son had died quickly in the first explosion and had often spoken of returning home to Paris and marrying his fiancée. Such letters attempted to give meaning and dignity to deaths that occurred in a sudden storm of steel. In 1985, a French survey of Mers el Kébir survivors asked whether they still blamed the British for the attack. Many said that at first they had felt intense anger toward Britain, their own government, and the situation itself. They could not understand how their recent ally could open fire on them so brutally. Over time, however, some came to see things differently. One former mechanic's mate, Lucien Dupont, described how age and study changed his view. He came to believe that the British, isolated and fearful, truly thought they were acting to prevent a greater catastrophe. He no longer blamed them personally, but rather blamed war itself for forcing such choices. That shift from personal blame to a broader condemnation of war's cruelty became a common theme among veterans on both sides. While sailors remembered the explosions and the screams, Winston Churchill remembered the order he had given. By the time of Mers el Kébir, he had already lived a long life of public service, but even he found this decision uniquely tormenting. On the eve of the attack, he confided in private correspondence that he feared the world would see the coming action as an act of betrayal and barbarism. He agonized over whether any decision he could take would be truly right. In this private reflection, he wrote that if he did nothing, and Germany later seized the French fleet, Britain might be starved into submission, and thousands or millions might die. If he ordered the attack, 1,000 French sailors might die at British hands, and Britain would seem the aggressor. He described choosing the course that seemed to offer the best chance of British survival, while fearing that history might one day judge that choice harshly. After the attack, Churchill addressed Parliament. He told the assembled members that British naval forces had acted with profound reluctance and a heavy heart. He emphasized that Britain had not wished to make war on France and acknowledged the suffering of the French people. But he argued that Britain could not allow the possibility that French weapons might fall under enemy control and be turned against them. He stated that he did not claim definitively that it was the right choice, only that it had been the only choice available under the circumstances and with the information then known. Parliament responded with applause, but Churchill later admitted that this reaction troubled him. He felt as though they were applauding the deaths of French sailors whose blood was, in some measure, on his hands. That applause, he said, would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his post-war memoirs, Churchill spent considerable effort explaining and defending the reasoning behind Operation Catapult. He framed it as a measure that demonstrated to friend and foe alike that Britain would fight on, whatever the cost. Yet even as he justified the action, he conceded that no leader could ever be completely certain that such a decision had been right. He admitted that necessity did not erase the moral burden. Historians have continued to debate the necessity and morality of Operation Catapult for decades. Those who defend it argue that in mid-1940, Britain genuinely stood alone and faced an existential threat. They note that the French fleet was a powerful force, and that had it been captured or coerced into Axis service, the strategic balance at sea might have shifted fatally against Britain. To them, Churchill's fears were harsh but rational. These defenders emphasize that Churchill had to act on what he knew and feared at the time, not on what later events would reveal. They point out that trust in Darlan's word might have been admirable, but also dangerously naive in a world where governments were falling and allegiances shifting under pressure from Nazi Germany. In their view, the destruction of part of the French fleet was a tragic but necessary insurance policy on Britain's survival. Critics, however, argue that Churchill overestimated the risk and failed to explore alternatives fully. They contend that the French could have been given more time or more attractive options, such as sending ships to distant neutral ports or placing them under some form of international control. They stress that Darlan's promise was ultimately fulfilled at Toulon, and that the French never did allow Germany to seize their fleet. To these critics, the deaths at Mers el Kébir represent a failure of diplomacy and imagination. They accuse Churchill of allowing strategic paranoia to overshadow trust in an ally's word. From this perspective, the blood spilled in the harbor stains his legacy as much as it demonstrates his resolve. They view Operation Catapult as an avoidable atrocity wrapped in the language of necessity. A third school of thought sees the episode less in black and white and more in shades of tragic ambiguity. Scholars in this camp argue that Churchill was right to fear the potential misuse of the French fleet, but wrong to assume that only violent destruction could eliminate that risk. They frame Mers el Kébir as an example of the kind of impossible choices leaders face in total war, where every option carries heavy moral and human costs. For them, the central question is not whether Operation Catapult was absolutely right or absolutely wrong, but how war creates situations in which even well-intentioned leaders must choose between competing catastrophes. Churchill chose what he saw as the lesser catastrophe, but the fact remains that more than 1,000 men died as a result. The scuttling at Toulon later revealed that the feared catastrophe of German seizure was one the French themselves would prevent. Time has not fully settled the debate. Even more than 8 decades later, scholars, veterans, and descendants of the dead still wrestle with the meaning of Mers el Kébir. Some see in it a harsh but necessary demonstration of British resolve that impressed both Germany and the United States. Others see in it a stain on the record of a leader otherwise celebrated for his courage and clarity. At Mers el Kébir today, a memorial stands to honor the 1,297 French sailors who died in the attack. Each year, on July 3rd, French and British naval representatives gather there to lay wreaths and observe moments of silence. The ceremony symbolizes not only remembrance of the dead, but also reconciliation between two nations that once fired upon each other in fear and confusion. In British memory, Operation Catapult often appears as a footnote to larger narratives about the Battle of Britain and the global struggle against Nazi Germany. In French memory, it remains more sensitive, bound up with the trauma of defeat, occupation, and collaboration. Yet both sides increasingly acknowledge that the tragedy of Mers el Kébir cannot be understood simply as betrayal or simple necessity. It was something more complex and more human. After the war, Britain and France rebuilt their relationship, eventually becoming close allies within NATO and the European project. The bitterness of 1940 gradually faded under the pressures of the Cold War and shared interests. But the story of Mers el Kébir still lingers as a reminder of how fragile alliances can be when survival is at stake, and how quickly yesterday's comrade can become today's target. The 1,297 French sailors who died at Mers el Kébir did so as victims of a decision that may not have needed to be made, but that was made in earnest belief that it would prevent even greater horrors. They died because war compresses time, narrows options, and leaves leaders staring at incomplete maps of the future. They died because, in that moment, fear outweighed trust. This is the legacy of Operation Catapult. Not a clean victory or clear defeat, not a decision that fits neatly into categories of right and wrong, but a painful illustration of how even civilized nations can be driven to uncivilized acts in the name of survival. The ships have long since been razed and scrapped, the harbors rebuilt, the uniforms changed. But the memory remains. Every July 3rd, the question echoes again over the waters of Mers el Kébir. Was it necessary? Perhaps there is no final answer. Perhaps the only honest conclusion is that it was war, with all the tragedy, paradox, and moral compromise that word implies. And perhaps the truest lesson lies not in taking a side, but in recognizing how easily fear and uncertainty can turn allies into enemies and shared victories into shared grief.